call the Ordinance Committee meeting to order, July 17th, 2018. May we start with the roll call?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse. Here. Mayor Murillo.
Here.
Madam Chair Snedden.
Here. And do we have any public comment not agendized? Okay, so we will move on to our item for consideration, introduction of ordinance for private submetering of water cross-connection control and other Title 14 revisions, and start with staff report. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Dana Hoffenberg, and I'm a Water Resources Specialist, and I'm going to be talking to you today about our proposed ordinance for private submetering, cross-connection control, and other Title 14 changes. So the purpose of this ordinance is to provide flexibility in our water metering policies by allowing for private submetering. It's also to create comprehensive code language to support the city's cross-connection control program and to update and clarify our existing Title 14 language and policies. So we're first going to start off with the private submetering portion of the ordinance. So some background first. The city does have an existing requirement that all new residential dwelling units be served by a dedicated city water meter, and this requirement dates back to the early 90s. The state has recently passed a law that became effective in January that now requires at a state level all residential units to have a separate water meter. So again, with the existing metering requirements, the city does currently require all meters serving dwelling units to be city meters and for those meters to be located at the curb. When space at the curb is limited, a city master meter is installed at the curb with city submeters placed on private property in a centralized location. So this existing situation does have some issues. Just generally speaking, city infrastructure on private property is problematic. Some of these issues include easement requirements, access issues, and complex plumbing configurations. These kinds of properties also require very special time-intensive billing. So our proposed solution is with this ordinance to allow private submetering. So the general rule under this ordinance would still be that all city meters must be located in the public right-of-way. However, if there are space constraints, the director may authorize city master meters with private submeters on private property. So the city would read, bill, and maintain city master meters, but the private submeters would be billed, read, and maintained by the property owner or property manager. So again, going back to the bill that I mentioned earlier in the presentation known as SB 7, this became effective in January of this year. It requires all dwelling units to be measured with either a utility meter, so that would be the city, or a private submeter. And the bill also creates a framework for private submetering and includes how property owners must bill for water service and other tenant and consumer protections. So under the ordinance, when private submetering would be allowed is when there's not enough space in the public right-of-way and the director authorizes the private submetering. Accessory dwelling units also may use private submetering, although that is an existing requirement under a separate ordinance. And then private submetering may also be allowed for certain ultra-high water use efficiency projects. So these projects must achieve a certain score by an independent rating institution. And they would still be limited to 6 dwelling units per master meter, which is consistent with some other exemptions that we already have for water metering. So the independent rating institution that we're currently working with is the Water Efficiency Rating Score, known as WERS. This is a third-party water-specific verifying tool. It takes into consideration indoor and outdoor water usage. It has already been codified in the Santa Fe Residential Green Building Code, and the Water Rating Index, which is similar to WERS and is based on WERS, has been incorporated into the draft National Green Building Standard. So that's the end of the section for private submetering. So if we have any questions on that before we move into cross-connection control.
Thank you. Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So when we're talking about meters, are we talking about transmitting meters for the most part, as opposed to having ones that have to be manually read?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse, so all city meters at this point in time are manually read. The private submeters could be manually read, or they could be AMI meters. It's up to the developer what meter they choose.
I know that we talked obviously about electrical meters, but at one point in time I thought we were trying to phase out the manual meter reading and going to transmitting. So that's not the case within the city? Ms. Dyer.
Madam Chair, Councilmember Russ, the city has long-term plans for transition to AMI. All of our new meters that are being installed are AMI capable, but we don't have the technology in place to do the transmission of the data. So they are capable of it in the future, and that's something we're currently working towards in the future.
I was just thinking about the proliferation of with the AUD of doing these multi-unit projects where you'd have master meters, but then you'd be on private property with your sub-meters, as we talked about here in the discussion. The purpose of, I guess you'd want to be able to audit individual meters in order to say that if a landlord had, for example, a master meter and had sub-meters billing out, then the city would then be reading those sub-meters, or would the master meter would be what we would read, and then the landlord would be responsible for that bill?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse, that's correct. So moving into the private submetering, the city would be reading, billing, and maintaining only the master meter, and the submeters would be read, billed, and maintained by the private property owner or property manager. So the city would not have anything to do with the private submeters.
But there would be some kind of oversight to ensure that the landlord wasn't overbilling for the use of water for a tenant?
That's correct. So the state law does have very detailed regulations on how the landlord must bill the tenant. And then also weights and measures can be involved. The meters have to be sealed by weights and measures. And if if the tenant has any issues with how the meter is working, they can always bring in weights and measures.
And in terms of the number of meters per dwelling, so it's limited to 6 that can come off of a master meter. Is there a logic behind the limit of that?
Well, that's only for the water efficiency rating system projects, and the intent of that was really to incentivize developers to go above and beyond what's already required in our plumbing code and landscape design standards. So it's for those ultra high efficiency projects. They could go through this WERS rating system to demonstrate that they're going above and beyond. We still wanted some level of data available to the city, so limiting it to 6 dwelling units per master meter helps us with controlling data management. If there is an issue on the property, then it helps with leak detection when we have limited the amount of dwelling units on the master meter. In the case where we have other projects where there's a lot of 80 to 90 dwelling units on the project, we're not sure if 6 dwelling units per master meter would even fit in the public right-of-way, so we didn't put any type of limitation on those types of projects. It will be really a case-by-case determination.
And last question, I promise. And in the case of a water protest, as we do from time to time, where people can protest their water use if it's extraordinary, and they're on a sub-meter, would that protest go to the building department, or would that be through their landlord?
Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse, that's a great question. And it gets to the reason why we have city meters at the curb. That's our preference, is to maintain that relationship with our customers and have the data readily available to us. If there's a project where there are private submeters installed and the tenant has an issue, they really need to work it out with the property owner and use the state as the enforcing agency if there's any issues. If they would like our help from the Water Conservation Program coming out and looking for leak detection, we of course are still willing to do that, and we would be available to help, but would request that they provide us any data that they have on water use in order to be more efficient in helping them.
Okay, thank you.
Madam Mayor Murillo?
Well, thanks. So my concerns are about consumer protection, and not to say that somebody's out there wanting to cheat their tenants or the people who live on the property by charging them too much for water. So I saw on one of your slides something referring to consumer protection, but I would hope that the city would help them. They are our water customers. And that's one just hesitation that I have on this, that I trust the city to bill people properly. do I trust that intermediary to do the same? Any response on that?
Honorable Chair, members of the committee, Dan Hinchke, Assistant City Attorney. The SB 7 has a very detailed requirements relating to the billing and the maintenance of the meters and the relationship. Much like any tenant-landlord relationship, a lot of that is governed by state law, and the city stays out of that kind of a transaction. The enforcement is through private enforcement. If we have, for example, a low-income resident, the relationship might be referred to a tenant assistance program or a legal aid program, but the city doesn't get into that. With regard to the extraordinary water use, we do maintain the relationship with the landlord through the city meter. So if there is an extraordinary use on the property as a whole, we would be involved in that by alerting the landlord, reading it through the master meter. The amount of water that can be consumed on the property can't be in excess of what goes through the master meter. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. And then I had a further question too. The Senate bill is very thorough in tenant protections also, and
That's right. You saw this at the Water Commission, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And the text is included here, and it is thorough. And that brings me to the point of this is really a compliance issue with state Senate bill, correct? I mean, this is something that is now mandated for all new dwelling units, and this is our response to compliance. Is that correct?
Honorable Chair, members of the committee, yes, that's correct.
Thank you. Do we have any public comment on this agenda item? No. Okay. So I believe it's to the commission if we have discussion.
We still have the
think
next
they
part
have
of
more.
the...
Oh,
yeah.
I apologize. Please continue.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I'm Maggie Heinrich. I'm a water resources specialist with water distribution, and I've worked in the cross-connection control program for the city of Santa Barbara for the past 7 years. What is a cross-connection, you might ask? It's a connection between the public potable water system and any other source or system. It can also be on private property as well. It can introduce pollution or contamination in the drinking water system through backflow, and it can be prevented with backflow preventers and backflow prevention assemblies. Backflow preventers are required for irrigation systems, swimming pool fill lines, restaurant equipment, industrial equipment, hospital equipment, any water-using equipment that potentially could add a contaminant to your system. Here's a picture of a very simple cross-connection with a hose. It's a construction site here in the city, and they had the hose sitting in that mud puddle and going into the hose bib, and if somebody had hit a fire hydrant or we had a fire situation pulling a lot of water from the meter, anything that would reduce the water pressure in the water system, we could potentially siphon that water out of that puddle through the house and back into our system, contaminating everything with who knows what's in there. Here's one in a janitor's closet. Its chemicals are being added for cleaning, and it's hooked into their water system. So that also needs to be protected, and we want to protect the private and the public system from those possible toxins. And you have an additional cross connection there with the hose hanging down off the spigot there. Your faucets and your sinks have a natural air gap, which is a cross connection device actually. But when you put the hose in there, you suddenly have it going below the fill line, and you could potentially do the same thing as you did with the hose in the puddle. This is one of those big double-check backflows that are used on fire lines. Fire lines are not metered water. So this is an example of water theft, actually. They have a hose hooked up to the #1 test port there, and it's not protected by the backflow, and it's also not metered. So that's something that we always look out as well. But I also wanted to show you what a double check backflow looks like, so you might recognize them. And this is a reduced pressure principal backflow. This way you have some context on what I'm talking about. This is a form of protection that we like to have on irrigation systems. It's sometimes on some hospital equipment, anything that actually would have pollutants that might make you sick, because it has a built-in air gap that'll release water whenever there's a break. Let's see. Thank you. So state requirements. The state water codes require the implementation of a cross-connection control program and the requisite local ordinances that define our authority, our responsibilities, our policies, and our procedure. The city currently does have a robust cross-connection control program. We monitor about 4,000 devices right now in the city. And we took it over from the county in the early 1990s. And our system protects both our meters and internal hazards because we did get it from the county health department. There are no comprehensive ordinances that's currently required by state law. Right now, we pull from pieces of the municipal code in Title 14. We pull for the plumbing code, and we pull from Title 17 of state water code. So we are using our authority, but we don't have a very clear ordinance in line. The existing language is vague. It doesn't cover all of our components, and it doesn't provide us with our clear authority to enforce the program requirements on project sites. The proposed ordinance is modeled off of industry standards and also off of existing ordinances adopted by other communities within California. It provides clear language on cross-connection control requirements, our program implementation, our enforcement, all in one location so that the public and staff all have one place to look for the information. And it provides authority to bring our customers into compliance with program requirements and with the plumbing code. And it better protects our public water supply from potential contamination. I'm available if you have any questions.
Thank you. I have just a quick question. So when this came to Water Commission, there were, it's actually a comment also, just several different edits suggested, and these have all been now incorporated into this document. So it has been reviewed by the public and by Water Commission as well. Thank you. Any other questions from the committee? No. Okay. Thank you.
So we do still have a couple, just one more slide. So there are some other miscellaneous Title 14 changes. So they are incorporated into a table that was included in the staff report if you want to look at those changes, and we can answer any questions you have on those as well.
Thank you. So it's to the committee. Do we have any discussion or questions? Mayor Pro Tem Ross?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I was just going back, I was talking about meters per lot, and I was thinking about in terms of what we're going through right now with ADUs and lot splits and whatnot. So were there a lot split that would then require a separate city meter to service that lot, even though it might be serving the same project?
So if there is two separate dwelling units on two separate lots, then each of those dwelling units should have their own meter.
Or master meter?
If something is on two separate lots, they probably shouldn't be master metered. A master meter is really only for
The multi-unit.
a multifamily unit development on one lot where that's very dense and there's not enough room in the right-of-way to put the meters. If there's enough room to split a lot, there's probably plenty of room in the right-of-way to fit the amount of meters necessary. So I would predict that they would probably need to have two separate meters for the two dwelling units.
And then going back to my question once again about the transmitting meters. So as we move forward with these projects and developments and multifamily units that are being proposed all over the city, is there? I know there's probably a selection of acceptable meters to the building department in terms of what you can or cannot install. Would those necessarily be types that could be either converted to or are transmitting meters? So if and when we do get to that level of our city service, that they'll be able to be part of the system?
Yeah, so Madam Chair, Councilmember Rouse. So as far as private submeters go, there's a list of submeters that are acceptable per weights and measures. So those meters aren't, it's not a city list, it's a weights and measures list that they would have to work off of. I believe some of those meters have AMI capabilities, although they're not city meters, so I'm not 100% sure. But in talking with some industry people about private submetering, that's the impression that I've gotten from some people in the private sector.
Thank you.
Mayor Murillo?
I'm just ready to move this to the city council with a recommendation. It will improve our water department operations and benefit the public. Did you want me to make a motion, or do you have comments?
Oh, I just had one more quick comment. It occurred to me that it might benefit some tenants and protections as well, because rather than distributing the cost of the water to the whole AUD project or whether a larger project, it would be taking into account, there'd be incentive to save water for one individual versus another. So there could be benefits to that too. But I think we are ready for a motion.
I'll move the this to the city council to make these changes to the municipal code related to our city water system.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. I believe with that we are adjourned.